Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a deep dive where we're tackling some uh, truly extraordinary source material.
Extraordinary is definitely the word for it.
What we have here is essentially two linked pieces. First, there's this detailed investigation focused on Pope Francis.
Right. Looking at his perceived state as of a specific date in the near future, according to this source.
And that's woven together with claims about prophecies, surrounding the papacy and the future of the Catholic Church.
But what's crucial, and this is what makes this dive so, well, unique,
Uh-huh.
is that the source material itself also includes a separate discussion about the method used for this investigation.
Okay, the method.
Yes, it's described as involving an external operator accessing information, sometimes called the Grifasi Method.
Right.
And significantly, this discussion from the source itself lays out how reliable, or maybe unreliable information, is actually obtained through this method. It offers some pretty strong caveats.
Oh, okay. So the source kind of warns you about itself.
Pretty much, yeah. So our mission today is to guide you through this. We'll pull out the most important claims and, perceived insights from this very specific viewpoint.
Helping you understand what's being put forward.
Exactly. But we're also going to constantly hold that up against the source's own explanation of how reliable information is truly acquired using this technique.
It sounds a bit like being given a map, but the map maker tells you up front, hey, most of these lines might be smudged or just wrong.
That's a great analogy. And you can only find the accurate points by comparing it to thousands of other potentially smudged maps.
So we're looking at this specific map today, but keeping that map maker's warning clearly in mind.
Precisely.
All right, let's jump into the heart of the source's investigation claims then. This gives us a perceived snapshot of Pope Francis on Friday, April 25, 2025. The description of his perceived nature is, well, it's striking.
It really is. The source describes his perceived composition, or ADN, as they put it.
ADN.
Yeah, like DNA, as being 82% reptiloid, specifically the gargoyle type.
Gargoyle type, okay.
And they use these French terms, brute, primitif, gluant, moche, which means, rough, primitive, slimy, and ugly.
Wow, and the other 18%.
That's described as a mix, an amphibian and human blend. But, and this is key, it's noted as purely technical, just for enabling physical incarnation. It doesn't represent any human feeling, apparently.
Huh. That's a very specific and, frankly, bizarre perceived description.
Yeah.
And where is he depicted as being at this moment?
In what the source calls his subliminal space.
Yeah.
Which they say is like his room in the Vatican.
His subliminal space. Okay.
And he's perceived as being accroupi, crouched, just sort of waiting.
Waiting.
Yeah, and interestingly also described as being connected to a main ship with a grand chef, like a big boss.
So not just a physical location, but some kind of perceived energetic link, a connection.
Exactly, a non-physical connection. And internally, his perceived state is complex.
Oh, so?
Well, the source paints this picture. On one hand, a perceived sense of mission accomplished. But right alongside that, perceived reproaches. And these reproaches are supposedly because he didn't do more to destroy human well-being.
Didn't do more.
Wow.
Yeah.
He's described as having two faces, one good, one destructive, and feels accablé, which is like overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed.
And the distinct perceived feeling coming from him is that the mission was too heavy. And crucially, this links to the next point, that he is dead.
He is dead. Okay, that idea ties directly into another major claim in the source, right?
Yeah.
About the timing of his perceived death.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is a key point in this investigation. The source claims he died before Monday, April 21st, 2025.
Which was Easter Monday.
Exactly. And the subsequent announcement of his supposed death on Easter Monday is claimed to have been deliberately orchestrated.
Orchestrated. For what purpose, according to the source?
The perceived goal was apparently to intensify sadness, shock, and fear on the faithful.
Okay.
It's depicted as a reaction because things supposedly weren't going as planned for, well, whoever was orchestrating. It was designed to create this state of sideration.
Sedation, like shock or paralysis.
Precisely. That plus sadness and fear, generating an energy perceived as a bad omen.
So the source is claiming this wasn't just, a death followed by news. The timing of the announcement on Resurrection Day itself had a deliberate hidden meaning.
That's exactly the claim being presented. His perceived departure on Resurrection Day was not a coincidence, it says. It had a specific hidden occult meaning, orchestrated specifically to instill fear in believers.
Fear. And how does this perceived fear mechanism work, according to them?
The claim is that it serves to remind believers that the Pope, despite his position, is just a man, mortal, no inherent resurrection power himself.
Putting them in their place as mortals.
That's the phrase used, yeah. In their place as men and mortals.
Oh.
And the source claims this fear, amplified in churches, is then used to collect negative energies for these perceived entities.
Entities, okay.
The material really stresses this. Everything is orchestrated and wanted. Nothing is left to chance.
Right. Let's connect this perceived manipulation of fear to prophecies. The source talks about that too, doesn't it? Especially the idea of a last pope.
It does. It interprets the last pope prophecy through this exact lens. It's presented as adding another layer to the fear.
Especially for people who find comfort and community in religion.
Exactly. People invested in, the traditions, the rituals, prayer, baptisms, marriages, that sort of thing. They fear it all ending.
And what happens with the energy generated by that fear, according to the source?
Well, the claim is, because the faithful fear the prophecy coming true, they desperately want the church to continue.
Naturally.
So this motivates an increase in fervor and prayer trying to stop the prophecy. And according to the source, this resulting energy is then somehow captured and diverted.
Captured and diverted. The source also mentioned the Malachi prophecy, I think, about Rome's destruction, the Last Judgment.
Yes, that gets incorporated into the same framework.
How so?
It's similarly described as contributing to an egregore of fear. This collective fear energy is supposedly used to make people more faithful, more fervent.
Generating more of this energy they want to capture.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
There's also a really dark detail about the church hierarchy itself within these claims?
There is. The source perceives the hierarchy cardinals, prelates, as basically auto-destructing from within.
Auto-destructing from what?
From internal issues, perceived as jealousy, covetousness, betrayal among themselves. This is seen as leading to a decline in vocations, fewer priests.
And they know this is happening.
The source claims they're aware of this internal decay, yeah, but they're desperate to maintain their perceived power, which is described as a kind of state within a state.
Okay.
And this power, for now, is claimed to be sustained by the fear and the increased fervor of the faithful that we just talked about.
Right, it feeds back into itself. Shifting focus a bit, what does the source perceive about the future of the church as an institution, its relationship with the wider world after Pope Francis?
The perception presented is one of fundamental continuity, especially, it says, in covering up scandals.
Continuity and cover-ups. Okay. Anything else?
Yes, there's a strong emphasis on the perceived continued secondary status of women within the church hierarchy. It uses a French phrase, un milieu d'hommes fait par les hommes et pour les hommes.
A world of men made by men and for men.
Exactly.
And how does that perceived situation fit into the source's bigger picture?
Well, this situation is perceived as maintaining people in obeisance, obedience.
Obedience.
And the source claims this suits governments. It's depicted as a sort of reciprocal arrangement, benefiting both the church hierarchy and secular powers by keeping populations compliant.
Interesting. What about the next conclave, where the next pope gets chosen? Does the source's esoteric information touch on that?
Oh, yes. The overriding perceived priorities for the next conclave are summed up as continuity and money privilege power.
So maintaining the status quo.
Pretty much. The primary concern is perceived as keeping things exactly as they are, preventing any dispersal of the church's, vast perceived wealth, and maintaining all the existing privileges and power structures.
And the cardinals themselves.
They're described as a closed circle.
Yeah.
Perceived as living in incredible luxury. Clothes, furniture, the works.
Wow.
And they are claimed to be actively maintaining a system specifically designed for them to benefit from the church's wealth.
So what kind of person is perceived to be selected as the next pope to, uphold this system?
The source expects the next pope to be Italian.
Italian. Okay.
And they are perceived as needing to be someone with a poigne.
A firm grip.
Exactly, a firm grip, someone capable of rallying the sheep. But this rallying is interpreted as maintaining the entente connivence, the understanding and collusion among the cardinals themselves.
Keeping everyone in line.
Basically, yeah. The goal is to ensure absolutely nothing escapes their control. It's described using another French term, très serti, meaning very tightly set or fixed, like a jewel in a setting.
Very tightly controlled. Let's circle back to that initial perceived image of Pope Francis. In his subliminal space, crouched, hearing reproaches, did the source explain where that critical voice comes from?
It did, yes. The source claims the voice reproaching him is actually his own.
His own voice.
Yeah, representing perceived guilt, dissatisfaction, self-flagellation, all originating from within him.
And the source makes a really remarkable claim about how he perceives this self-suffering.
That's a particularly dark detail, isn't it? He is perceived as taking plaisir à se faire mal.
Pleasure in hurting himself.
That's what it says. The source uses terms like se flageller, s'insulter, s'autocritiquer, flagellating himself, insulting himself, self-criticizing.
Goodness.
And this perceived suffering is described as his paradise. It's characterized as very reptiloidian, linking back to that initial description of his perceived nature.
So he enjoys this self-criticism.
He's perceived as feeling he is growing through this and pleasing his master.
Ah, yes, the master. Who is this perceived master?
A very large humanoid, apparently.
A humanoid?
But the source clarifies the relationship isn't like a traditional master-vassal thing, where the humanoid is directing him. Instead, the humanoid is perceived as simply profiting from the Pope's self-inflicted pain and his perceived state.
Just feeding off it, in a sense?
That seems to be the implication.
Okay, returning again to the idea of fear energies forming egregores, the source claimed these are significant. What's their perceived reach?
According to the source, these collective fear energies are claimed to surround the whole Earth.
Surrounding the Earth.
And they're linked specifically to the fear of not following church rules, feeling constantly watched, surveilled by a perceived eye that watches and judges.
An eye, watching and judging.
And this perceived force is described as very violent, very powerful.
What was the source's perception of Pope Francis's view of Jesus? That seemed unusual too.
Yes, the claim is that Pope Francis saw Jesus as someone who essentially failed his mission. Failed. Despite apparently having some kind of perceived adoration for Jesus, the source claims the Pope perceived himself as superior because he lived longer than 33 years.
Superior because he lived longer.
That's the claim. And this perceived sense of superiority is linked to a revanche, a revenge or retaliation energy, supposedly stemming from a perceived difficult childhood.
Okay.
The source says he felt better than Jesus and had perceived vanity about it.
Vanity. There are also some extremely disturbing claims related to his perceived stance on social issues, specifically abortion.
Yes, those are very difficult claims. The source claims his conservative stance is perceived not just as a belief, but as something that feeds on the suffering of women and children.
Feeds on it. How?
Leading to abandonment, misery, and... well, the most horrifying claim is the alleged use of abandoned babies in sacrifices.
Sacrifices. Wow, that's quite an accusation. Did the source provide any specifics?
It claims to have witnessed a specific instance, yes, a supposed sacrifice in South America in 2025.
Witnessed how in this subliminal investigation?
Presumably through the same perception method, yes. It involved a brotherhood claimed to be attached to the church, using an abandoned baby left for dead.
This is deeply disturbing.
It is. The baby's subliminal part is perceived as perpetually suffering and programmed for sacrifice. The source also states an attempt to connect with this subliminal part was unsuccessful.
Okay. And how does the source perceive Pope Francis's actions regarding fighting sexual abuse within the church? That's obviously a major public issue.
The claim here is very blunt. The source says this effort is perceived as entirely fake.
Fake.
Fake. And that he is perceived as actually laughing about it privately.
Laughing about it.
Yeah. Instead of confronting or attacking abusers, he is alleged to have intensified fear among victims, telling them to be silent.
Wow, that's a stark contrast to the public persona.
It certainly is, according to this source's perception.
Finally, the source touched on his perceived future path, potential next incarnation.
It did. The source claims he wants to return to this planet, but under specific conditions. Yes. He is perceived as being part of a group of bad omen, described as an elite of evil.
An elite of evil. And his future mission.
According to this source, his future mission is claimed to be to do harm under a good appearance.
Harm under a good appearance.
And the source adds that many other consciousnesses are perceived to be like him, existing specifically, it says, to do harm.
Okay. That is, well, that's a truly intense collection of claims and perceptions from this first part of the source material. It paints a very specific and frankly bizarre picture based on this investigation.
Extremely bizarre, yes. Now let's pivot, because the second part of the source material is absolutely critical for understanding how the source itself says we should approach the claims we just spent time discussing.
Right, this is where the source provides the context for its own information.
Exactly. This is where it turns inward. And it states very clearly that information obtained through methods like hypnosis, presumably referring to the technique used for the investigation we just detailed, is molto contaminata.
Very contaminated.
very contaminated. They state there's a very high percentage of distortion.
Okay, so right off the bat, they're saying the info is likely distorted. Do they say why?
Yes, they give reasons. According to their explanation, the perceived information travels through various dimensions and densities.
Uh-huh.
On its journey, it's said to pass through other consciousnesses, which can distort it, voluntarily or involuntarily.
Other minds can mess with it.
Apparently. And then, critically, the information is interpreted by the subject's own mind, the person undergoing the hypnosis. It gets filtered through their personal beliefs, their culture, past experiences, even their language.
So multiple layers of potential distortion.
Exactly. The source uses an analogy. It's like trying to communicate underwater with different languages. The sounds and images are just inherently going to be distorted.
That makes sense. Underwater communication.
Yeah.
Messy. And this leads to a very strong statement they make about single sessions, like the one presenting all those detailed claims about the Pope.
Absolutely. The source emphasizes that a single session is absolutely counterproductive and useless for obtaining reliable facts.
Useless for facts. Then what's the point of a single session, according to them?
Its only stated value, according to this source, is purely as a vehicle to access a client's personal problems so they can be worked on therapeutically. That's it.
Okay, so if one session is useless for facts, how does the source claim reliable information is obtained using this methodology, if ever?
Only, they say, by comparing data from thousands of sessions. Thousands. With different people, different operators, all working independently.
Thousands.
The reliable information, they claim, is only what emerges as consistently the same across the vast majority of these thousands of sessions.
Finding the common thread in a huge amount of data.
Precisely. And this consistently reliable information is described as a very low percentage of the total data gathered, maybe only 2 or 3%.
2 or 3%, what about the rest?
The overwhelming rest, they say, is effectively trash. Their word.
Wow. 97, 98% trash. That's a huge caveat. And was there a point made about trying to get info on people not directly connected to the person in the session, like asking about Pope Francis if he's not the client?
Yes, the source notes that getting reliable information on unrelated third parties might not even be possible through this method.
Not possible, or just difficult.
It says it might not be possible, or even if information is perceived, some cunning entity, again, their term might deliberately provide false information, just taking advantage of the situation.
More potential for deliberate misinformation. Okay, so bringing these two parts of the source material together, you have the detailed, frankly, wild claims from the investigation on one side.
Right, incredibly specific stuff. Percentages, dates, entities, motivations.
And on the other side, you have the source's own severe warnings about its method, that it's very contaminated, mostly trash, useless for facts in single sessions.
And that reliability only comes from massive cross-referencing of thousands of sessions, yielding maybe just 2–3% reliable data points.
What's fascinating here is that stark contrast. It's almost a contradiction presented within the same source material.
It really is. The source presents these incredibly detailed claims and then immediately tells you why you probably shouldn't trust such detailed claims from a single instance of using its method.
Which definitely raises an important question for you, the listener. If, according to the source's own definition, most information from this method is highly distorted, unreliable in single instances, how does that influence how you evaluate the specific, detailed claims made in that single investigation we discussed earlier?
Yeah, how do you weigh those claims against the method's own stated limitations?
What stands out to you from everything we've unpacked? Especially when you hold those claims up against the source's explicit caveats about how true reliability is achieved within its own framework.
And maybe even stepping back further. What does the very nature of the source presenting these details, alongside a methodology that seems to discount most such details as unreliable, make you ponder about how we evaluate information in general, wherever it comes from?